This is Where Did the Road Go? Our aim is to explore the fringe, to be true skeptics and question openly, to investigate the paranormal, bring light to the dark corners of history, and give a voice to the shunned of science. We deal in mystery and the important questions that these subjects bring to light. What is reality? Who are we? And why are we here? Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com for a full show archive, links to all our social media, upcoming schedule, and much, much more. Now, join your host Soraya on this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
And welcome to this week's show. Tonight we will... all right, tongue. Good way to start. Tonight we will be talking with Clelland and Aaron Gulyas in part 2 of our history of the UFO phenomena. But real quick, before I do that, in 2 weeks, I have Douglas Dietrich coming on. And Douglas, by far, is going to be the most controversial interview I've ever aired. And it's actually already been recorded. We recorded 3 hours worth of an interview. And I had to cut him off at that point. So there's going to be 3 shows with him. The first one will be in 2 weeks. And he also has a conference or a UFO conference coming up in 2 weeks. So I gave him the opportunity to talk about that for a minute and tell you what was going on. And then you'll be able to hear the interview in 2 weeks. So just for your information, here's Douglas Dietrich. So real quick tonight, I have Douglas Dietrich, who's going to tell us about something he has coming up. He's going to be on the show in a couple of weeks, but he'll be on the show at the same time this is happening. Hello, Douglas.
Hey, it's great to be here, Mr. Asgath, and it's great to be here with your listenership. I know that you're broadcasting in upstate New York. That was where my father was born and grew up, so it's a lot like teleporting myself home.
And you're going to be doing a whole presentation on the Battle of L.A. coming up at UFOCon?
Yes, and it's very important because it's part of the Second World War, and I definitely am under the awareness that the majority of Americans don't know what happened during the Second World War as a whole, let alone what happened in the Battle of Los Angeles specifically. So the Battle of Los Angeles was the Stalingrad, or the Leningrad of the Pacific Theater of war. It extended the war by nigh half a decade, and it cost the Americans well over 4.5 divisions. It was probably one of the singular most decisive battles of the war, and of course the American military-industrial complex developed a dismissal for it through their propaganda that has been utilized for many events ever since, which is that of aliens from space. So that dismisses it right away in the minds of academia and professional journalism, and it dismisses it in the minds of many Americans who are educated by those media, and the rest of the people who pursue it try and reinforce that which is dismissed. So it becomes locked up in a paradigmatic circle which no one really escapes from until they really hear the information from a whistleblower like myself, who worked with the United States government destroying documents for many years. And I do want people to know that this is something that was an example of biological warfare in use, and the entire city of Los Angeles was going to be willingly sacrificed by the United States Armed Forces, not your government, but a branch of your government, in order to prevent a breakout from infecting the rest of the United States. This is what, in the end, cost them very close to 5 active divisions and many more men besides in terms of personnel, and lengthened the war to the extent where the Japanese were able to declare a victory, which is something that will be explained in context of the Battle of Los Angeles presentation. So very much thank you for allowing me to speak to that. The UFOCon itself can be found in terms of information, how to buy tickets, at www.ufocon2015.com. Once again, that's www.ufocon2015.com. It'll be on March 28th and March 29th, so it'll be the last weekend of this month. Myself and 11 other speakers, about 2 panels, some special guests, and we definitely will have a Meet the Speakers fundraiser. Aside from that, I'm certainly very approachable throughout the weekend and very much invite people to just approach and discuss whatever it is that they want to discuss for detail or for clarification. And this will all be at the American Legion Hall in Santa Clara, California. And once again, just buy your tickets ahead of time, because that helps everyone immensely with paperwork, keeping things in tab, and is a lot less stressful for my managers, Lori and Ann Fenton, and much less stressful for anyone who enters at the last minute, trying to buy tickets at the last minute where we have to make room for them, especially when it comes to the banquet and other areas where you'll be hobnobbing with the speakers. So thank you for allowing me to inform everybody about that upcoming event, because I think that it's time that the reality of the situation is exposed to many people. Basically what I am is very similar to Daniel Ellsberg, another former Marine, and he exposed the what was known as the Pentagon Papers, which busted open the Vietnam War and ultimately was one of the factors leading to the resignation of President Nixon. In my case, these are the Pentagon Papers of World War II, along with what Mr. Ascath and I will be discussing on his own program about the Roswell incident and the Second World War itself as well.
All right, so I'll talk to you in 2 weeks, Douglas.
I really look forward to that. Thank you so much, sir. You take care, and my best wishes to you, your family, your staff, and your listenership.
And that was the 60-second talk from Douglas that went on for almost 5 minutes, because he is rather wordy. And but there you go. DouglasDietrich.com, too, if you want to check out his website. And I am now going to bring in Mr. Mike Clelland and Aaron Gulyas. How you doing, guys?
Not bad.
So.
Very good. It'll be hard to play second fiddle to Douglas Dietrich. I hope we can top his rhetoric there. So
yeah, wow.
I should. He seems like a very likable guy. I've heard him interviewed before. I cannot. Oh, it's hard to fact check his stuff.
That's the problem.
He becomes fast and furious. Yeah.
I spent about 45 minutes talking to him before we did the interview, and he is a very likable guy. I have no idea. You know, like you said, it's so hard to fact check. You can fact check certain points, but beyond that, he doesn't have the documentation because he destroyed it, because that was his job. So you kind of got to take his word on it and see what you can actually pull up on your own. He does, when we talk, he does cite a few resources here and there, some more obscure books that were written by people that still exist, and yeah, it's up for people to just make up their minds on that one. It's hard to say one way or the other.
I think, like a lot of these things, regardless of proof or evidence, there's an interesting narrative being told. So that's some fun stuff. So I'll have to tune in for that one.
I very much enjoyed listening to him, and that's basically what I did, because he talks nonstop. I'm not sure he even breathes. So, how are you guys doing? You both doing all right?
Pretty well, yeah.
And Mike,
very well. Yes, very well.
Mike, you have relocated to not too far from here.
I am living in upstate New York, up near the Canadian border, near Lake Placid. Yes.
So hopefully we'll be able to get you in studio, maybe with Peter Robbins sometime later in the year.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. Where, I mean, it would be a little bit, who knows what's involved in getting down there. It would just be some time in the car, basically.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't think we're going to see Aaron in studio anytime soon.
Not unless I've got a conference going on up around that area, which is always a possibility.
Well, that would be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the only way I travel anymore.
Have you spoken, Aaron? Have you spoken at conferences on this subject?
Not on this subject in particular. Actually, a couple of times when I was working on the Contactee book, I gave a paper at the American Pop Culture Association on exopolitics and its role in the 2008 election. So some of the Obama as the disclosure candidate, I did a brief paper on that. And I've talked about some other fringy stuff at mostly at the American Culture Association conference and the Pop Culture Association conference, but not in as hardcore a fashion as I would like. Sometimes it's while it's tempting, it's also kind of, the danger of being branded the UFO guy at these things. And then when I want to do other things, people are like, oh, well, but you're the UFO guy. So sort of trying to segue out of that into I'm not sure what, but
kind of like Mike is the owl guy.
Yeah.
Well, I've kind of come to, it's actually, whatever. If you're going to be known for anything, it might as well be known as the owl guy, because I actually do find it fascinating and I enjoy the work that I'm doing. So,
right.
It has not become a curse yet. Let me just put it that way. So.
Yeah.
And once your book comes out, there'll be no getting away from it.
Well, I mean, who knows? Whatever. I can just, yeah. I mean, it's, as I said, it has been endlessly fascinating. So, it's not that I can't be too self-critical of my own, chosen. Well, I feel like I didn't choose this path. It felt like, the path was thrust upon me. So.
All right. Okay. So I think last time we left off around the 1960s, actually, and we were talking about contactees and stuff, which was Aaron's forte.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not mine, so yeah.
Right. And so in the 1960s, not only did you have the contactees, but you had a lot of just random UFO sightings. And the whole flying saucer book craze took off.
Well, there was certainly a flying saucer book craze in the 50s. Probably not the late 40s. I don't know actually when the very first flying saucer book or UFO book was published, but it had to have been right there at the late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, I know Adamski's book came out fairly early in the 50s. I can't remember offhand when Donald Kehoe's first book came out. I think Flying Saucers Are Real was the first one, and 1950. I had it here on a web page that I was looking at.
Huh.
So he wrote. His article, Flying Saucers Are Real, showed up in True in January 1950, and then Flying Saucers Are Real, sort of the expanded version of that, was also 1950. So yeah, not a lot in the late 1940s. It picks up the pace in the 1950s, and then by the 1960s, it's starting to get into, if not the mainstream, it's breaking out of that enclave of magazines like True and Fate and things like that. You're getting more coverage in things like Look magazine, Saturday Evening Post, Time and Life, and things like that in the 1960s.
And the host of science fiction movies.
Yes.
And those science fiction movies existed in the 50s also, so that would be a little unfair to say they just popped out of nowhere in the 60s, but they certainly continued on in the 60s.
And then they kind of just died out after that. Like the 50s and 60s, all this stuff was huge, and at the end of the 60s, it seemed to just kind of grizzle out a little bit.
Did it? I don't think that's true. Really? I mean, there was all kinds of things that,
But not to the same extent, it seemed. At least to me, it doesn't seem that way. It seemed like there was a craze going on in the 50s and 60s that leveled off a little in the 70s.
Yeah, I think there was a decline in the 70s, but I do think it was still going in the 60s. And in the 60s, you also get more television treatments of these things, because television's coming of age as a medium as well. So in the early 60s, you get some great Twilight Zone episodes that deal with the saucers. Monsters Are Due on Maple Street is just one of the best half hours of television ever, in my opinion. Is all these manipulative, sort of evil manipulative space brothers who are prepping us for oh gosh, no, it's not a spoiler. It aired 50 years ago.
Exactly.
It's if you don't know that To Serve Man is a cookbook, just leave now. But yeah, we had that. We had the Invaders later on in the later 1960s. And in the 70s, I think it was 60s or 70s, Project UFO went under a couple different names, but the Jack Webb series.
That was based on Project Blue Book.
Project Blue Book, yeah. I was saying, actually, I misspoke before. Project UFO was a late 1970s show, not late 1960s. So it's well after Blue Book closed down. It's well after the Condon Report, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in a while.
Right.
So it did come on the heels of like one of you said, Close Encounters, and that's that era of film science fiction.
Okay, and also at the end of the 60s, you got kind of the alternative thinking of people like John Keel and Jacques Vallee popping up.
Yes.
Yes, and in the dawn of the 60s, you certainly had the Betty and Barney Hill case, though that didn't make it to the press until the late 60s.
Was it late 60s?
I think it was the late 60s. Okay. Yeah, I think it was printed in Look magazine in the very late 60s. Okay. So that was the dawning of the alien abduction lore in popular culture, even though it certainly did show up in things like The Outer Limits. And I will also put forward that the culmination of Kubrick's 2001 is certainly Dr. David Bowman is abducted and taken to a strange, timeless place. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the thing about the abductions in the 1960s, and I hesitate to use that word because that wasn't a word that came until much later. So the excessively physical and not quite consensual contact experiences, we might want to call them, and just more and more coverage of weird flying saucer contacts. It wasn't just the Friendly Space Brothers or just lights in the sky. You start seeing more and more stories during the 1960s of people encountering pilots on these craft that are just weird. Coral Lorenzen and Jim Lorenzen, who ran APRO, which was one of the big UFO organizations in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, wrote a book in, I think, 1966, 1967 called Flying Saucer Occupants, and it was just a collection of stories of people who had met people or creatures in flying saucers, and it has a handy little chart in the back describing all the different kinds of flying saucer occupants that people encountered, and it was incredibly varied. It was the tall, sort of Nordic-looking blondes, and it was weird little dwarfish creatures, and some of them were robots, and some of them looked human but weren't quite. So it was remarkably varied. But on the one hand, you have that, and on the other hand, you still have Donald Kehoe and his NICAP organization being very, very, very conservative and concentrating on, collecting endless amounts of sighting reports and downplaying anything that that even remotely looked like a contactee experience, because they were sort of very worried about being tainted by what they thought of as sort of carny charlatans.
Yeah. As is MUFON today is very hesitant to, it's obviously changed a little bit, but they are very, I think the core of the organization is they collect sightings reports, and they don't like to stray from that. And then I actually had one guy at MUFON tell me, which was it was an honest answer. He said, I used to do abduction stuff, but it just took so much time.
Yeah.
Basically he was saying it's easier just to, go and collect sighting reports. It doesn't get so sloppy and all over the map. So that the APRO issues are still, happening right now in the one mainstream UFO reporting agency that's still around.
Right.
Yeah. The thing about MUFON is, and I know we're getting ahead a little bit,
that's all right.
But
they started in the 60s. So
yes, they did.
So there we got the 60s tied.
Right. Okay, we're still on track. Their TV show, what is it, Hangar 1 on the History Channel, is actually, I think, quite a shift for MUFON. Going towards things that are a little more speculative, a little less sort of dry, which is the 1 year I was a MUFON member, the magazine was just deathly dull. It's just oh man, it's a bunch of people trotting out what passes for an 8th grade science experiment, and here's my numbers and here's my data. It's like, that's not data, that's a story about a light, and sort of downplaying all the really interesting stuff that goes on. But Hangar 1, it does get into some of the highly speculative things that tie into the broader extraterrestrial conspiracy culture and the government role in these things. Even the name, just invoking the idea that there is a hangar where all the records are.
Well, actually, I think that is actually true. There is like a room at a hangar, and I think that even some of I think the exterior that they show is actually the hangar, though the interior is not.
Right.
And then I will also say it is a type of made-for-TV documentary filmmaking that I just find completely unwatchable. What did we talk about? We talked about Ancient Aliens last time, so I feel like I'm repeating myself almost word for word. Yeah, there's this modern cable TV, what passes for documentary is something else entirely.
Yep.
It is and then I think that MUFON lends their name to Hangar One the same way that like Alfred Hitchcock lent his name to like Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine.
Yeah.
So
and on the one hand, I'm thinking, well, that kind of move can damage your reputation, and then on the other hand, I think.
They don't have any reputation.
It's MUFON. Who cares? Oh no, MUFON is less credible than it used to be. Who cares?
Well, I think there are folks at MUFON who do care and then treat themselves as if they are, a reputable organization. And I think that there are things within the organization that attempt to be reputable.
Yes.
But it just seems like, how to say it?
It's not enough.
They're just so cautious about stuff, and there's just so much stuff going on below the waterline that they're just so timid about jumping into. Now, that said, I could probably sit here, and I won't do it because it involves people's identities and stuff like that. I know a lot of people who work for MUFON who are, who will sort of whisper that they've had the direct contact experience, and they would be abductees, and as one woman put it, her name is Elaine Douglas, who was fired from MUFON, and she was doing abduction research. I won't go into that now. She's since passed on, but she basically said 50% of the people at MUFON have had these beings, have basically woken to these beings in their bedroom.
Wow.
Huh.
So,
50%.
That's just, I think that was a little bit off the cuff, and I think she was trying to be a little bit, inflammatory with that comment, the way she used it. She sent it to me in an email, though I do trust that she's speaking from some authority on it. So I don't know, 50%, like there's somebody made a joke to me one time and they kind of looked at me very seriously and they said, that 74% of all statistics are made up on the spot.
I think I've used that line once.
Oh, good. Okay. So,
yeah. That's a good one.
So she, who knows? But I mean, I think it would be surprising and startling the number of people who are working for MUFON who have, in essence, had these beings in their bedroom at night. And
I can certainly see why given MUFON's attitude towards some of these things, that they would be uncomfortable with people playing that up. So
she was axed for other reasons that we.
Oh, okay.
Or once we get up to the 2000s or the 2010s or whatever, we can get into that. So.
Okay.
Let's see if we can make it there tonight.
Okay,
we're still in the 1950s and
Barney Hill,
60s.
And that was the core of the 60s, and then the Shermer, he was the fellow that was the cop that was taken on board somewhere in the Midwest, wasn't he? Like in Oklahoma or something like that?
Yes, I
Harold
believe
Shermer or something like that. Yes, and I think that the culmination of that, the only thing that I find, I can't really remember all the details of it, but he was, there was a series of sightings and contact experiences which don't seem to play out presently, where it was sort of driving down the road, there's a landed flying saucer, you stop the car, some, nice, amiable aliens kind of say, hey, come on board. And you walk on board and they kind of show you around and then they say, okay, now it's time to go. And then you walk off. There's a series of those. The guy who ate the pancakes, what's his name?
Yeah. I don't remember his name at all.
I'll remember it in a little bit here. But
there was also the guy in South America that had sex with the alien.
Yeah.
And was all traumatized by it.
That was Villas Boas, and that was technically in the 50s.
But the story hit the U.S. in the 60s. I think it did come from the APRO newsletters. They were the first ones to get the translation of the story and work with somebody down in South America. So it's in their Flying Saucer Occupants book, sort of one of the earliest write-ups of that in English in the 1960s, but it was a 1950s event. Yeah,
and I think it was the Shermer case. The punchline, which I just love, is he asked, like, well, what are you doing here, and what am I supposed to do, and why are you here, and they answered, the aliens told him, they said, we want you to believe in us, but not too much.
Not too much. Yeah.
So I still think that's kind of, maybe they're up in the ante a little bit lately, and so that was I just thought that was a great line. And it was when he said "you," it sounded like they were speaking more to humanity rather than to Harold himself.
Right. Yeah, I love that line. We want you to believe in us, but not too much. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, no one would make that up.
Well, yeah, especially at that time.
Yeah.
I think hoaxes have gotten a lot smarter in current day because there's so much information out there.
Yeah. People are...
Okay, so in the 60s, there was a television show called The Invaders, which is worth watching. They're in high definition. They're good quality episodes, and they're all on YouTube. Every single one of them you can search out on YouTube, so you can watch them in order. And there's one episode, I'm not going to try to Google and remember what it was, but Fritz Weaver, the character actor who was in a bunch of Twilight Zones and such, he is in this episode, and he plays like the he's at the embassy of some obviously sort of fake Eastern European country. They kind of give it a name, Kyrgyzstan or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so he's like kind of this Cold War thing, and they've got some secrets about the UFO stuff. What's the character's name? David Vincent. David Vincent sneaks in and to steal something out of the safe and sort of gets put in their dungeon, and then then the aliens come in. So there's this scene in where they come up to this car pulls up to the gate of the embassy, and it's pretty high quality actually as far as television filmmaking for that era, and it's the Men in Black. They're dressed like the Men in Black. They don't have quite black suits on, but they have that kind of bland
sinister
face, and they are the aliens. So the aliens are coming in, and they're trying to get in, and they come up to the booth. And it's just the way it's photographed. The guy from the booth kind of walks out and looks at them and talks to them. You can't really hear what he's saying. And then he comes back in, picks up the telephone at the booth that's at the gate to the embassy, and says, "The men from Point Pleasant are here." This was before the Point Pleasant events, which were the Mothman events, mm-hmm. which are certainly a stalwart of the 1960s, weirdness. Yeah. So I cannot figure out how they managed to slip that line in there. I think that all the events took place in 66 and 67, and I'm pretty sure that episode was from 66. So how that got my only way to think of it is that the scriptwriters probably had like a clipping service for UFO sightings or something like that.
Probably.
And they had, which was for anyone under 40, the clipping services, like they were services that would go through the files and literally take a scissor and cut out things, put them in a big envelope, and so you could get topics sent to your home or office, or if you're doing research on something. So that's my only guess, is that somehow they slipped that in because of something from a clipping service.
And I remember, I think it was in Jim Moseley's autobiography, The Confessions of a Grave Robbing Ufologist. I forget, Shockingly Close to the Truth. That's the name of it. He talks about Roy Thinnis, the star of The Invaders, being a pretty big UFO buff and appearing at one of the national UFO conferences around that time. There's a really good article, if you just Google Invaders Fred Chrisman. There's a blog post at Silver Screen Saucers by Ken Thomas, the conspiracy writer behind Steam Shovel Press and a whole bunch of really good books, about how Fred Chrisman, who was involved in the Maury Island incident back in the 40s, when the first Men in Black things, actually predates Kenneth Arnold's sighting, and who was also, some believe, connected to the JFK assassination. Apparently, Chrisman told some people in a letter that the plot of The Invaders was based on his life and secret missions he'd undertaken, or something like that. So there's all these weird connections around The Invaders. Of course, with what has become sort of the standard, paranoid conspiracy trope of they look just like us, but they're not like us, that sort of thing. Yeah. So it's very emblematic of the era.
And let's talk about Mothman, because that was a big event that some people don't even realize was connected to UFOs.
Right.
But that was kind of the key point in it, is that there were all these UFO sightings. You have the Men in Black, and you have the Mothman.
And you have the collapse of the Silver Bridge,
right?
As almost as if the Mothman or the UFOs were sort of like the tragedy itself somehow manifested or predicted, manifested in advance of this horrible tragedy.
Right. Was it something that they did, or was it something that they were attempting to warn people of? Was it just something that happens when some manifestation, like you said, of the energy of whatever's going to happen happens? It's sort of a constellation of weirdness.
Yeah,
exactly.
That was happening around there, and there's a military-industrial complex connection to it with the Union Carbide plant that was near Point Pleasant. There's a couple good books about people who were there. It was John Keel's Mothman Prophecies,
obviously,
of course, but also Gray Barker's book, The Silver Bridge, has been republished in a form that is actually available to purchase for less than several $100s, like the remaining copies of the original run. And one thing I like about Gray Barker's treatment of the incident over Keel's is that Barker was, about as much of a local guy as you could get. It was not too far down the road from him. He was in Clarksburg, and Point Pleasant was not that far away. So his approach to talking to witnesses and talking to people who'd seen these strange things is a bit better, because he knows the people, he understands the culture, the society of West Virginia in the 60s. And John Keel was, a guy from New York who came down.
Well, he was actually from upstate New York, so he grew up on a farm. So
True,
he was,
true.
It wasn't like he was the thin man or anything like that.
Right. But he was still more of an outsider than Barker.
True.
Would have been.
But he's the one that...
And I have not read Barker's books. And I think you can get... I think you can get the Silver Bridge on Kindle.
You can, yeah. Okay. Andy Colvin.
I was just going to say that, yeah.
He's been republishing a whole bunch of Gray Barker stuff in the last couple of years that I need to stock up on, because a lot of really obscure things that Gray Barker wrote that went out of print very quickly are available again.
Andy's also been republishing a lot of Keel's articles and talks and stuff as well.
Yes, so which is excellent.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And the Mothman element of that whole thing just adds to the overall weirdness. And I think it's probably one of the first really weird thing that happened that people know about as far as the UFO phenomena gets. The first time where people just stop and go, how is this even connected to UFOs?
Right. It opened things up. It opened up the UFO field in a very John Keel way to being something more than nuts and bolts physical objects flying through the sky. There's something truly paranormal about it. With the Mothman, the appearances evoke, both cryptozoological things and also, just weird psychic events where people, sort of a consensus reality where you are thinking about something so hard that there's a physical manifestation of your thoughts right there. So it was very, very strange. And then the bridge collapse, I'm not sure how well it would be remembered if it wasn't for the bridge collapse. If there wasn't some sort of event to really cement that whole constellation of weirdness in people's minds. And of course, Keel's book popularizing it, and later writers talking about it as well.
Any thoughts, Mike?
I agree. Yeah. In fact, I'm writing this book on owls, and one of the things that did come up in the is that people were dismissing the Mothman as a giant owl, which also happened in the Flatwoods Monsters case, as well as the what was the case from Kentucky, the Hopkinsville.
Hopkinsville,
yeah, where that was dismissed as an owl too. So.
All right.
Dismissed with, it didn't really quite make sense that people were just so quick to say, oh, that's an owl. People were mistakenly seeing a big owl.
And of course, with the Mothman prophecies, you also have a lot of Men in Black type of stuff going on too. Kind of an overdrive, really.
What's his? Yeah, and that's where Andy Colvin is probably the better person to address all these things.
Yeah, he's deeply knowledgeable. He lived in the area for a while.
I've had Andy on, and I'll say his information is hard to parse through.
Yes, it is. It's very dense. I've read some of his Mothman's photographer books, and they're the kind of books that they're full of a whole lot of stuff, and I feel like I need to keep a flow chart going as I read it to try to connect all of these things that are going on. But another thing, as far as owls, what Mike was saying, the Flatwoods Monster in West Virginia was also described as being similar or reminiscent of an owl, red eyes, wings hanging down, things like that. So,
owls do not have red eyes at night. They tend to have greenish eyes, similar to a cat. If you were to shine a light on them. Yeah,
and I think the owl. People have described it. What people have done is skeptics have looked at what people have said about the Flatwoods Monster and said, well, it probably sounded like an owl, as opposed to the people who actually saw it, who didn't say, oh, it looked like an owl.
Right.
So the owl thing is one of those things that's present in a lot of these phenomenon, but in some cases, like Flatwoods, I think, has also been used to dismiss them, which is odd, because if you've looked at the drawings of the Flatwoods Monster, it doesn't really look like an owl.
I think from a debunker's standard, though, they can look at and say, well, you saw something big that startled you at night, must have been an owl.
Yeah, I mean, and Occam's razor kind of backs that up, but except in the cases when the simplest explanation isn't true.
Right.
And the truth is actually made
Very
up of
complex,
something. Yeah, made up of something that we can't even fully explain. We don't have words for it. So, yeah.
If a winged monster you didn't get a good look at startled you, probably a good chance it was an owl.
Yeah. Yeah, or a giant bat.
Well, true.
True.
Depending on where you are.
Yeah, those will freak you out.
Now, at the end of the 60s, too, you have Jacques Vallee having his revelation that these current UFO experiences are very similar to the fairy faith. And eventually he tied it into all kinds of other religious miracles and stuff like that, but that wasn't until the 80s. But he had that one moment where he said, look, this might be the same phenomena with a different face.
Yes.
And that we're still in that right now. We're dealing with this phenomena that has all kinds of theatrical elements that seems to be matching what we want to see in this scientific paradigm that we live in now.
Yep.
Yeah, the whole concept of pareidoia, we look for patterns in things. That's just how our brains work a lot of times. And just like somebody might see an otherworldly creature, and somebody might see something completely prosaic and normal, and some people see something so strange they don't have any framework in which to put it. And I think what Vallee did, which was really, really valuable, is put these things into the context of, like you said, into the context of folklore. And he wasn't the first to connect the two. There was, I can't remember his name, but in the I think 1950, there was an article in the Journal of the Hoosier Folklore Society called "Flying Saucers and Folklore," and it didn't necessarily say these flying saucer stories are like what happened in old folk tales. What this author was arguing was that flying saucer belief, even at that early point, was developing a mythological system of its own that was reminiscent of how fairy tales come to be. So he called it basically a fairy tale system for the 20th century, which I just found this article in a journal when I was looking for something else a couple months ago, and I couldn't believe that early on you had scholars of folklore and folk culture looking at the flying saucer phenomenon, and particularly some of the early media coverage of it that emphasized the sort of fairy tale nature.
Well, Carl Jung himself published the book, Flying Saucer, a myth of things in the sky, basically saying that we are. He postulated that we were generating that myth of things in the skies, of mandalas, a reflection of the self in the sky. And I think that was from the I mean, didn't he die in the early 60s, like 61? That book was from the mid-50s, somewhere.
The book came out, I want to say 53 or 55.
Something like that, yeah. And that, very early on in the flying saucer craze, he chimed in with this, very far-reaching idea that is, I don't think it's 100% accurate the way it's borne out now, 60 years later, but it's certainly, I think Jacques Vallee has built upon that in a way that that more closely matches the data, let's say.
And the other thing around that same time period, and I forget exactly when this would have been, but you had Wilhelm Reich, and I've done like 3 shows, I think, with Peter Robbins on Wilhelm Reich and his connection to UFOs, where he would use his orgone accumulators and UFOs would show up.
Yeah, I don't know enough about Reich, but his stuff was very interesting, and of course the from at least one point of view, the suppression of his work.
Yeah.
And does the suppression tie into the UFO aspects of it too? So
well, he was also the orgone being sort of orgasm energy,
right? And that was
in the puritanical 50s. He was blackballed for being kind of a pervert. Almost.
Yeah.
And put in jail. Quite honestly, yeah. So,
oh yeah, he died in jail.
Yeah.
But that's another kind of weird factor into it that most people have no idea even exists.
Right.
And if people want to know more, they should just go back and listen to the shows with Peter Robbins, because Peter Robbins knows a lot about Wilhelm Reich, and we talk about the whole UFO connection there, and it doesn't help things make any more sense, I'll tell you that.
And also the fact that the sort of dirty little secret about the UFO contact experience is there's all kinds of extremely weird sex involved in this stuff.
Right.
And gets reported all the time by people who have the contact experience, whether willingly or unwillingly, are subjected to weird if the reports are to be I mean, I guess I should be careful what I say, but I mean, I know a lot of people who've had very, very challenging, I'll leave it at that, experiences that at the hands of these aliens. So somehow this sex aspect plays into the which is the same thing in the fairy lore.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Succubuses and incubuses and things like that.
Yeah, and all throughout mythology, sure. Yeah.
And going back to the Antonio Villas-Boas case, there's the sexual aspect of that as well, where the strange, pale, redheaded, looked fairly human but not really woman, sort of gave him the business, and he was sort of it wasn't entirely consensual on his part, but he didn't have the power to resist.
Right.
And then he was sort of ambivalent about it. In at least in the stories that have come through the translators from South America here up to the States. But yeah, the sexual stuff, which ties into the psychological aspects. We were talking about Jung, but the psychological aspects of all this as well. Regardless of what the experience was, there's a way that people respond to these experiences. So when you throw sexual encounters in there as well, that adds another layer of psychology and sort of cultural conditioning on top of everything else that's been experienced. So it's the more you look at it, the less simple it becomes.
Yeah.
The more you study all of this, the more complex it becomes, and that process begins in earnest in the 1960s, as you have a wider variety of types of experiences come to be reported. And you also, through Blue Book, have the Air Force acknowledging that, yes, it is looking into these cases, which adds the layer of government scrutiny on top of everything else. It's all just getting very complex during this decade.
And Mike, you called it alien, and I think that is probably the best term for what it is. I mean, assuming it has some external component, it doesn't have to be extraterrestrial to be alien to us. And I think that above all, no matter where it's coming from, it is completely alien to us. And it might be.
And yes, if you look up in the dictionary, one of the definitions of alien is, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, but I like this definition, and I feel it fits nicely. It's in Webster's, and I think it says something to the effect of, so different as to be unknowable,
Right, right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and even if it's a projection from some part of ourselves, that part of ourselves is so alien to us we don't recognize it. You know, so whether it's extraterrestrial, whether it's interdimensional, whether it's coming from a vibration right here alongside us that we can't see most of the time, whether it's coming from us somehow or time travelers or whatever explanation you want to use, it is, if nothing else, alien.
Yes.
And let's get into Project Blue Book and all that. So that started, when did the initial one? It wasn't called Project Blue Book at first.
There was earlier Project Sign, I think, was one of the earliest.
Yeah.
And then Grudge, and then Blue Book. Blue Book comes about, and
then also in that same era was the Condon report out of the University of Colorado.
Right at the very tail end of the and which led to the end of Project Blue Book.
Right.
Fairly directly. Yeah.
And the thing I always find interesting about it is people will use it to say, well, there's no UFOs, the government's investigated, but what they actually said is that UFOs do not represent a threat to national security.
Right.
They did not say there's no such thing as UFOs.
Right. I mean, yep. And it started in the early 1950s and went through January of I found some notes I made. Went through January of 1970, and you're exactly right. Their goals were: are they a threat to national security, and to undertake some kind of scientific analysis, which culminated in the Condon Committee, and also NICAP, the UFO organization, was growing exponentially during the 1960s. Over 10,000 members. Saying, I think that the phrase Kehoe used is there's instead of an iron curtain, there's a paper curtain of official secrecy between the public and for not Condon, for Kehoe, the cover up was an Air Force thing, with the CIA possibly being involved, but Kehoe really went after the Air Force more than anything else, because the Air Force were the ones who were supposed to be investigating this. And when the Air Force never came out and conclusively said, this is these are things that are not of this earth, and their explanations were not entirely, but almost entirely. I mean, the cliche is what you saw was the planet Venus,
right?
Or classically here in Michigan, we had the Hillsdale sightings where J. Allen Hynek, their scientific advisor, gave his famous, swamp gas or marsh gas explanation. What you saw was illuminated swamp gas, which was, ridiculous given what people had said. But Blue Book for almost 20 years was the Air Force was investigating thousands and thousands of claims, and looking for scientific things, which led to the Condon Committee actually undertaking a scientific investigation.
But they
supposedly,
supposedly, because I mean, it seems like they didn't really want that; they just wanted to bury it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where people were calling for an investigation, and then when they got an investigation that didn't come up with the results they thought it should, clearly they were trying to do things down from the very beginning. And there are some things that Professor Condon himself said that really indicated that the fix might have been in from the very beginning. Yeah. But they didn't dismiss everything out of hand. There was a certain percentage of cases that they said, we cannot figure out what this could have been.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it's an alien spacecraft.
Correct.
I agree. That's
because there's a spectrum, right? It's a spectrum of, okay, we know absolutely that this is, a lenticular cloud on the one hand, and all the way on the other hand, you have the most radical exponents of the extraterrestrial hypothesis saying, how can they not be spaceships with pilots? And then somewhere in the middle, you have a sort of like, we have no idea what this is, but it's an unidentified flying object. And there was dissension within the committee. People like James McDonald was more on the side of maybe these sightings, there's more to them than we think. But the ultimate report that was issued in late 1969, it was almost 1,500 pages, and then the paperback came out, was under 1,000. It was shorter. It was under 1,000. I think the print was very small. I think I've got an old copy of the paperback version of the Blue Book report, and it is very tiny print. There's also like recommendations and conclusions, and basically the conclusion was there's nothing here. I mean, there's not only was there no evidence that these things were otherworldly, the committee also claimed there's really no point in studying any of it at all. Yeah. Because such an overwhelming percentage, they said, could be explained. There's no story here. There's nothing to we tried. There's nothing to scientifically investigate, and that takes a huge amount of wind out of the sails of flying saucers and UFOs as something that the general public could latch onto.
Well, then my defense would be that, then what is happening at the same time is, by some whatever estimates, that 10% of the population in America anyway has seen something very unusual in the night sky or in the sky, and then by some estimates, I'd be very cautious to give a number, but the number of people who've had the direct contact experiences is higher than anyone would dare imagine, is my sense. And so these two disparate things are happening at once. You're getting official declaration from on high, and then a small percentage of the population, can call bullshit on that because they have either seen something or experienced something directly that contradicts, the public or the statement.
Yeah, it's one of these things where even after the report was issued, there were critics of it, and critics not just from the UFO world. I just looked this up because I remembered it, but I couldn't remember where I remembered it. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, which is not a flying saucer outfit at all, said, yeah, we haven't found that the committee didn't find anything of scientific value in the cases they studied. And other scientists said, this is such a small sample. How much can it actually prove? But the Aeronautics and Astronautics organization disagreed with the Condon Committee and said, just because you haven't found anything yet doesn't mean we shouldn't keep studying it. Right. And the Condon Committee really clamped down on any further study at all. We haven't learned anything up till now, thus we will never learn anything ever. And this is one of the things that leads to the Air Force, shutting down Blue Book and basically responding to every question about flying saucers up to the present with pretty much the same form letter that says, the Air Force has undertaken many investigations and we have found no risk to national security and, et cetera, et cetera. But even at the time, there were people who basically said, look, there's something here. This needs to be looked at more. But as far as the public was concerned, a committee funded and commissioned by the government said there was nothing to it, so there's nothing to it. Yeah. And so membership in NICAP dropped, magazine subscriptions dropped. Mosley talks about it in his autobiography that his saucer newsletter began to decline in numbers throughout the 1970s as these sort of saucer doldrums kind of set in.
And then the 70s brought in, which was one of the most important UFO waves, was the 74, 75, 73, 74, 75, right in there.
Yeah. And the other thing is, if you read Jacques Vallee's journals, his Forbidden Science Part 1, he dealt with Project Blue Book. He dealt with Hynek directly because he was a close friend, and his vantage point on it is much different than most of what you hear other people talking about. And it's definitely worth reading, if nothing else, for that.
And then Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who's been doing research for well over 50 years. He started doing research in the early 1960s, and he's still around doing the research now. And he was asked to join the Condon Committee and did join and was a member early on. And he basically said there came a point when he recognized that this was a biased committee and it had an agenda,
right.
And he just left. So, and he says that without any, he's very clear that that's his sense, having been, inside.
And this is also a time period where people were more trusting of the government than they are, say, now.
Yes. Yeah, we still had, at that point, like 4 years left of trusting the government.
Exactly. That all came crashing to us.
Yeah, once we finish up with Nixon and Watergate and Vietnam and the Church Committee uncovering all the COINTELPRO stuff the FBI and the CIA were doing.
Yeah.
There's for a project, some research I'm doing now, I found some great statistics from the Pew Center, which just graphs this massive. It's like it falls off a cliff in 1974, 1975. It creeps back up a little bit in the early 80s, and then it just starts to go down again. So it's really sort of, I was going to say fun, but it's just depressing to look at, really. But
so one of the things that we come into in the late 60s and early 70s that gets connected to UFOs and isn't necessarily a part of it is the whole cattle mutilation.
Oh, yeah.
And, I've had Chris O'Brien on 2 shows, actually, we took to talk about the whole history of the cattle mutilations. And it seems to me and it seems to him that it's not necessarily UFO-related, but somewhere in there are UFO connections that don't make any sense. Just like everything else with the UFO field, there are these weird little things that stick out and go, what's that doing in there?
Right.
Exactly. I mean, there's Bigfoot connections to the UFO thing. There's things that shouldn't be there if we're dealing with the very simplistic explanation of metal spaceships coming from another planet. And I'm not actually one to talk much about the cattle mutilation thing. I haven't immersed myself that much in any of the books or literature. And it sounds like, according to I know Chris O'Brien and I trust his research. And I feel that there's where there's smoke, there's fire. There's certainly fire there, but I think that there's a lot of messy smoke too.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the things that jumps out at me, and this can maybe eventually segue us into the 80s, is one of the pieces of sort of paranoid literature that came out in the 1980s was something called the Krill Report, which was sort of a summary of our dealings with extraterrestrials, and it was most likely put together by John Lear and John Grace, I believe, to sort of muddy the waters and see where leaks were and things like that. But one of the things it talks about is that they had a psychic or a remote viewer of some kind investigating the cattle mutilations, and the list of things that came to this psychic's mind when they were at the site of a mutilation, it wasn't necessarily alien stuff. There was a lot of things like Lilly Pharmaceuticals was one of the things that jumps out. So there's some clearly there was some experimentation going on of some kind. It's too neat. The cuts are too neat and too proper for sort of clumsy farm side ranchy rituals or something like that.
Right.
Ranchy rituals. I'm not sure what that means, but it's not the local coven just surgically removing parts of cows. It's something that was done for more odd and suspicious and scientific reasons. There's also theories that sort of keeping it away from the UFO, that would keep it away from the UFO stuff. There was somebody, I want to say her name was Iona Hepner, back in the 90s. She was on Michael Corbin's old Paranet radio show, I believe. And she connected, I think it was her, that connected the cattle mutilations to research into genetically targeted biological weapons and chemical weapons. So imagine a biological or chemical weapon that would only kill people of certain ethnicities.
Right.
So, there's a lot of, in addition to the flying saucer hints that circle around the cattle mutilations, there's a lot of hints of really creepy scientific, military, industrial complex stuff going on as well.
And that's exactly where Chris O'Brien goes with it, that there's something there. But there's also these high strangeness cases that don't make any sense. Like there's a pattern to it, and then every once in a while there's this case that pops up and you go, what the hell is that? That doesn't make any sense to the rest of this, and actually seems to be impossible.
Yes. And and you could argue that the weirdness is caused by the cattle mutilations rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
Is this another psychic manifestation sort of thing?
Kind of a trickster phenomena that's clinging on to something that's already mysterious.
Yeah. Or something sinister, something evil, maybe. We have forces that rise up in response to that. So there's a lot of strange things it could be, but it certainly the cattle mutilations have become, at least in the popular mind, very, very deeply connected to UFOs, even though that's only a small part of the whole picture.
Yeah.
As well as crop circles. There's very fleeting evidence that UFOs are connected to the crop circle phenomena, though they certainly have occasionally been reported, and if the UFO in those most of the crop circle reports tend to be little glowing orbs, not a big metal spaceship.
And you figure most crop circles at this point are fake, but not necessarily all of them.
I would not say most. Would you? But anyway, no, I would not say most crop circles.
I know even Colin Andrews has even said that a lot of them at this point are fake, and has talked to some of the circle makers. This is why I'm going by him and Andrew Collins, to switch the names around. Had done research. Might have even been his first book, where he actually got to know a lot of the circle makers and can recognize their signatures in the crops, and said the majority of them are actually man-made.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, so I haven't read their data. I was at a crop circle conference last summer in England, and there was folks recognized that some of them are hoaxed, and
sure. And I don't know what the percentage is. Again, we get back to percentages.
Yeah, that's tricky once you get into that. So there's no way to really answer that. But there's so much there, and just like the anomalous stuff you were talking about with the cattle mutilations, crop circles have these very weird events that surround them.
And I think calling them hoaxes or fake, somebody's creating them. They're creating them for a reason, and there's I can't remember who was talking about it. It might have been Greg Bishop once was sort of talking about crop circles as a kind of as an art form.
Sure.
So human created possibly, but not designed to be a specific hoax to get people to think something that isn't true. So it's again one of those things where you have this human factor involved that sort of warps the phenomenon and makes it much more confusing.
And you are listening to Where'd the Road Go on WVBR FM Ithaca. We're talking to Mike Clelland and Aaron Gulyas. We're going to go another 20 minutes or so here. And Colin Andrews, with the crop circles, in his latest book, I mean, I think this is the first book where he acknowledges that many of them are probably man-made, but he also talks about the circle makers themselves having very weird experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Getting dreams that they should make a certain formation, or weird things happening to them in the fields while they're making the formations. And there's also the fact that these circles were showing up before anyone was faking them. It seemed the two guys who tried to claim credit for making all the circles, which was kind of ridiculous, when they were asked, well, where'd you come up with the idea? They said, all the saucer nests that happened back in Australia.
Yeah. They had something they were thinking of that was very similar. And I heard an interview with Andrews or read part of the book, but yeah, that's something I'd forgotten about, the idea that, yes, people are creating these, but why are they creating these? And are they doing it consciously? Or are people being used by some force we don't understand to create these for purposes we don't yet comprehend? It's all a lot stranger than flying saucers making a circle in a field.
Yeah.
Much more interesting than that.
And Colin Andrews, Colin Andrews, yes, I had to get that correct. Tells a story in his book Edge of Reality that the hoaxers, the very real people, were out there in the field, and if at that latitude in summertime, right? So England is pretty far north, and so the nights are short, so they're working hard, and all of a sudden they look off to the east, and there's like a glow of light coming up, and they all look at their watches, and they kind of go, "Oh crap, the sun's coming up. We're not going to finish this." And then they work a little while longer, and they look up, and there's no glow there, and I think they look at their watches, and it's like 1 o'clock in the morning. So somehow time got sort of backed up so they could finish the crop circle. And then they worked for a few more hours, finished it, and then the sun came up and they were able to sneak out of the field.
Yeah, I remember that story. And again, that's, just one of many in that book that he talks about that are just weird things that people have, like 2 people making different parts of a crop circle without knowing that the other was making it.
Yeah.
And it coming out symmetrical, and they're like, how did that happen? We didn't know those people were out there making another part.
Yeah, he has a story about some guy being motivated to go out and make a crop circle. He got up in the middle of the night and drove to the field, and then there was a weird fog in the field, and he realized there were people talking like nearby in these trees. And he was like, "Oh crap!" And he was very quiet, and he went about his business, and then snuck out, doing the whole thing himself. And the people in the trees that he was listening to were a bunch of kind of new age crappies that were out there performing like a ritual where they were trying to manifest a crop circle with a specific theme, and they had actually drawn it, and they were trying to manifest it. And this fellow, and I think Colin Andrews actually names the guy's name. I can't remember it off the top of my head now. He actually created the crop circle that they had drawn.
Yeah. And it's also possible, because we don't know what's behind the UFO phenomena, it is possible that the legitimate crop circles are being made by the same intelligence that is causing or is behind the UFO phenomena, but not necessarily made by UFOs.
Sure.
Yes.
It's just that we don't know what that is, unless, certainly some people think they know what it is. They think it's extraterrestrials, but the more you look at it, I think the harder it is to say simply that it's extraterrestrial. Again, you come back to that saying that it's alien, whatever it is. And it may be trying different ways to communicate with us. As your friend, Aaron, Paul Kimball says, he thinks it's one consciousness trying to express itself sort of artistically to us in some way and communicate with different faces, kind of like playing roles.
Right, trying to figure out what sticks, what actually gets the message across, or realizing that the same message can be conveyed to different people in different ways. So cycling through these different manifestations and reaching people at different times. It's an interesting. I think it's a more interesting way to think about it than wondering which planet these people came from, because clearly they came from somewhere. So hypothesizing about, well, they must have faster than light travel, and they must be this, and they must be that. So many people, including the big names in the field, are so married to this extraterrestrial idea that it's you're missing so many more, in my opinion, interesting explanations or possible explanations for what these things might be. It might be part of our planet,
right,
too, that we just don't understand yet. It could be something that's just a tenth of a second ahead or behind us in time, or some other plot from a Star Trek episode. It's all so much more interesting than lights in the sky. And I think during the 1970s, we start to see some of that come out a bit more. We have the much weirder things begin to happen during the 1970s. You have the emergence of the group led by Bo and Peep that would eventually in the 90s end in the Heaven's Gate suicides. Jacques Vallee talks about them extensively in his book Messengers of Deception.
Yeah.
That group got its start in the 1970s. You also have an explosion of the very sort of new age style channeling of messages from friendly extraterrestrials. It's contactees without all the embarrassing jumpsuits, right? It's it's things you can't prove or disprove.
Yeah.
I am speaking with the voice. I'm Tuella, the lady who called herself Tuella. Here's my book. What's your book about? I channeled Ashtar and the other enlightened beings who are guarding our planet from the evil beings. Well, what are you going to say to that? It's probably not something that she actually experienced, but there's no way for anybody to prove it. So things like Ashtar Command, which actually began as part of the contactee movement with George Van Tassel, and they split, and he was talking to Ashtar, but now Ashtar only talked to these other people, and they trademarked different aspects of Ashtar. And during the 1970s and into the early 80s, you have just this groundswell of these channeled messages from the aliens, and it's the sweetness and light. We should all love each other is still there, but you're getting darker stuff. You're getting the not just the more abduction experiences. You're getting Betty and Barney Hill's story going on primetime television as a made-for-TV movie with James Earl Jones.
True.
So the sort of sinister side of it is coming out. You have Close Encounters of the Third Kind coming out, which is a very different approach to alien visitation than something like The Day the Earth Stood Still. So the 70s were a remarkably fertile time. It's a neat bridge between the old style stuff and just the hardcore dark paranoia that's going to emerge in the 80s.
And also that there was as I said earlier, there was a flap, a sightings flap that was astoundingly profound.
Yes.
in the mid 70s that no one really talks about much now. People, locations having multiple sightings every night, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And that's something else interesting about the phenomena, that it does move in flaps, and it's more prevalent in certain areas of the Earth. And to me, that argues against an extraterrestrial type of an explanation, and saying that it has something more to do with our planet and maybe even its place in the cosmos, because why should UFOs suddenly hit us in 73, 74, 75 to an unusually high number of sightings, which also connects to a high number of cattle mutilations in the same time period, and then it just kind of stops?
Yeah, these things all seem to come in waves, don't they? They all seem to ebb and flow. And you have these waves of sightings, or you have the waves of the cattle mutilations, and then we have the issue, sort of research-wise, of trying to differentiate between, was there an increase in these things, or was there an increase in the reporting and promulgation of information about these things? How many people are having sightings and experiences who never think to tell anybody?
True.
So were the waves, how big were the waves? And to what degree did they really subside? So part of the issue is not just there's a wave here, and there's all sorts of weird things happening. It's also about the infrastructure of getting information to the public about these things that we have to take into account. So sort of looking at it from a sort of research and statistics perspective, it's incredibly difficult to get an absolute handle on numbers and trends.
There's also, and when you look at like what are called window areas, certain areas that have more activity than others, like Rendlesham, for instance, has an enormous amount of UFO activity throughout history. Why that one spot? Are spaceships coming down and saying, we just want to land there? Or is it something, Paul Devereaux, as I've mentioned before, in, I forget which book it was, but he shows that UFO sightings tend to line up with fault lines.
Yeah, and there's lots of discussion about things like ley lines and telluric current,
right?
And those sort of old school early 20th century ideas about I can't remember the guy's name, but he wrote The Old Straight Track about
Alfred Watkins.
Alfred Watkins about ley lines in Britain. So that's been married to the UFO and paranormal thing as well. And so it's one of those things, going back to Vallee, that goes back much, much further than 1947. If there are places, if there are physical places on the planet that are more likely to have these things happen, those things have happened, for as long as there's been somebody to record them. And what we're seeing now with UFOs is maybe just a manifestation that makes sense in a technological world like we live in.
Right. And also when you get to some of these places, they're also known for paranormal events as well as UFOs. So
Right.
it seems like there has to be some connection there. Otherwise, that really doesn't make any sense.
Sure.
But I'm thinking of like Sedona, Arizona, having
Right.
been a sacred Indian site long before it turned into a mecca for sort of New Age vortex sitters, and as well as the Hudson Valley.
Yeah.
Even there's a time travel or like a missing time story that was written in the 18th century, which is the not Ichabod Crane, Rip Van Winkle. Thank you.
Sure. So like it's hard for me to correlate an extraterrestrial presence with these window areas, with these flaps. I mean, the flaps maybe, because you could say maybe they're coming and going, but the window areas are what make it really strange to me. That make it that I think that's one of the first things that really started to push me away from the extraterrestrial idea.
Yeah, the fact that there are these certain locations.
Right.
Yeah.
And who knows, we might be dealing with some exotic technology that can only enter, they might be coming on metal spaceships from another planet, and they use the ley lines the same way we would use a landing strip at an airport, so they need those window areas.
And that's a great point as well.
So maybe something we don't know, that's, and my thought is that so I talked to one woman, and she made a very good point that when these visitations happened in her home, she would see basically the wall get all fuzzy. These gray aliens would enter her home, and then the wall would get fuzzy afterwards. And they would enter and leave through this sort of doorway that they had created. She was also dealing with what she referred to as the Blondes or the Nordics, and she said they would land their craft a few hundred yards away from the house, and then they would walk to the house and then come in through the front door. And she said that whenever the Greys would make these doorways, the home was plagued with poltergeist activity and paranormal activity that was just kind of messy and frantic. And her sense is that the Greys and the Nordics both knew about the side effect of creating the portal, creating the doorway. Just is a side effect that you get this poltergeist activity, and phones ring and electronics screw up, and you get clonking and doors open and close and such, and that the Greys didn't care if they interrupted the lives of the people who they were abducting, basically, though the nice Nordics did care, and they were polite enough to go a few hundred yards away so that the opening the portal wouldn't create the poltergeist activity in the home.
But you know what?
So there may be a completely this is total speculation on her part, but I love the idea. So there may be, you can't throw, we're juggling with these ideas that are completely alien, and just the definition we gave earlier. So we may be dealing with things that are so fantastically unknowable that we're at a loss to even guess what side effects they may have or not have. So
our brains aren't built for what is in front of us, and so it's like the cognitive equivalent of not being able to hear a dog whistle. It's just not. It's there and it exists, and there are some people who have the ability or the misfortune, depending on how you look at it, to be able to experience these things. And I think that's something that's always been with us. There's always been people who are more sensitive to these things. I've talked to people who feel the presence of in their case loved ones who've passed on, and they feel that presence, and other people just don't at the exact same time and place. So I think there's a personal sensitivity to it as well, and I think there are some people who see way more flying saucers than other people. I've never seen anything, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So it's very personal, and that's one of the reasons that, sort of like you said, leads me away from an extraterrestrial approach to it.
Right.
I'm much more in the camp of this is or they are part of our planet and part of our natural environment that we simply don't have the mental software to comprehend in most cases.
And I'm content to say that it is a mystery.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, that is a very, very good word for it. It is a mystery. And I don't think we even have half the pieces.
No. It's a jigsaw puzzle with no picture on it.
and a lot of pieces missing.
And no edge pieces. So we're just, and there's no box.
We're piecing together the pieces in the middle roughly and trying to fit some in over here. And yeah, that one fits. That's good.
Right. And in true trickster fashion, half the pieces have already been burned, and some of the other pieces are from a different puzzle, but we don't know that yet.
Right.
So it's very tricky, and I think that's what makes it fun, and that's what makes it kind of frustrating. I mean, if you look on Facebook, I lurk on the UFO updates page that's there, and in about once a week, I just say to myself, why do I even look at this anymore? It's 15 bad YouTube videos. It's something about disclosure, and somebody else with poor grammar is saying something that I can't make out because the grammar's so poor. And then
right.
It's like the sightings come in waves, but so do the stories and the narratives and the theories. There's really nothing new under the sun. Sometimes it seems, except conversations like this where you sort of push the boundaries of what things might be. But if I see one more person online say, so does anybody have any ideas about how aliens would get here? What kind of engine would their spaceship have to have? We've been talking about this since the 40s.
Right.
And the answer is, who cares?
You're right. Exactly. Exactly. This is not the question you should be asking. The question you should be asking is, why do some people see it and some not, and what does it say about what does our reaction say about us?
Yes.
And the questions you should be asking are any thoughtful person when confronted with this would they would have to dabble with golly geez, how does the spaceship work? They're gonna move past that very quickly. Mm-hmm. And anyone who's thoughtful will ask the same questions that any philosopher would struggle with, sitting in a lotus position on a mountaintop. That would be, who are we? Why are we here? What does it all mean?
Right.
Those are the questions that I find arise out of the UFO mystery.
Yes, absolutely. And it's weird that it seems to both bring us in and push us away at the same time. Like you were saying earlier at the beginning there when the guy went on the saucer. We want you to believe,
but not too much.
Not too much.
And it's like, well, how does that make sense? What are we missing?
I think that my sense is that things are being orchestrated purposely to confound, and it's like we're seeing a theatrical Zen koan in the sky, or in our bedrooms at night, and how people react. There are some people who react, and I'll just say straight up. I mean, that's one of the things I've been shocked at is how many people who will say, I'm doing energy work, and I've also had the UFO contact experience. Basically, I'm a Reiki healer, and I've had UFO contact experience. And some people will out and out say, they were on board a craft, and the aliens showed them their hands and did some sort of magic zapping using psychic means, and then they came back to off the craft and re-entered day-to-day life and started doing energy healing with profound results.
Right.
So this that's very easy to dismiss as sort of pie in the sky sensationalism, but the patterns are unmistakable if you ask the right questions. And I don't think that MUFON is asking those questions.
No, MUFON's asking questions such as, what shape was the flying saucer you saw?
Well, no, I will. Someone sent me a bunch of up-to-date MUFON forms recently, and it's not like they're secret or anything. And they, in among the questions were, what has changed since your sighting? And it's basically one of the questions is, do you have psychic experiences since your sighting? And there's a few questions, not as many as I would like, but they're in there. So someone, anyone who does this research would have to recognize these patterns. Yeah, they would hear them over and over again.
It's a good sign that they're sort of at least trying to. It sounds like connect the broader broader paranormal, parapsychological world to these sightings, because I know that years and years ago that certainly wasn't the way things were done.
Yeah. Well, we made it through about 2 decades here.
What are we up to? What, the 80s? Did we get to the 80s?
I think
we're at the edge of the 80s, yeah, so we're going to have to schedule a part 3.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good.
And I thank both of you guys. You want to tell people where people can get a hold of you and what you have out there? Why don't you go first, Aaron?
Okay. I have a website, ajgulyas.com, as well as a Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Aaron John Gulyas, AARONJOHNGULYAS, all one word. Stuff out now is my brief book of essays, The Chaos Conundrum, my heftier academic tome on the contactees called Extraterrestrials and the American Zeitgeist. And coming out in June is a book called The Paranormal and the Paranoid, which is basically an analysis of conspiracy theory science fiction TV in the 1990s. So trying to segue from being the flying saucer guy to being the bad pop culture guy. So that's what I've got going.
And Mike?
And I have a website, which is a blog. It is called Hidden Experience. And just Google my name, Hidden Experience. It comes right up. And the focus of my research lately has been completely devoted to this weird owl thing that I can't quite shake, and it has been all-consuming. And the problem is I'm getting such powerful, amazing stories. And I had a conversation with someone recently, and I said, I'm not a scientist. I'm more like Woody Guthrie. I just feel like I'm kind of playing the banjo and just kind of strumming these little folk songs. Like you meet some Okie on the trail, or on the train. That's a hobo, and you sing a hobo song. So I'm kind of meeting all these people with owl stories. So I'm kind of composing my owl opus here. It has been, we talked earlier that I was sort of stuck with the moniker as the owl guy, which is fine because it has the owl thing found me. I did not find it, and it has been endlessly rewarding and fascinating. So I don't have any problems with that at all. So yes, and I'm also working on a book. Who knows when that'll come out? But someday there will be a book on the shelf.
A 700-page book called what?
The working title is The Messengers, and the subtitle would be Owls, Synchronicity, and the UFO Abductee.
Interesting.
It'll be less than 700 pages. I can guarantee that. So
that's a lot of pages.
I could make it 700 pages without any trouble at all. So
you sure you don't want
it's going to be less.
Sure you don't want to call it The Owls Are Not What They Seem?
I write about that in the book.
Do you?
That line
Okay.
from Twin Peaks. Yeah, and my conclusion is that that line, which came from anyone who has watched Twin Peaks knows that there's kind of a cryptic line that opens the second season, the first episode of the second season, where a man mysteriously sort of enters a room, says that, and then it's as someone is lying there near death. And then there's a bunch of owl imagery in the series itself. My sense is that came on the heels of Whitley Strieber's book Communion, which the scriptwriters had to have had there in the the scriptwriting room, and they kind of riffed on that. Owls are owls are just as much a part of a spooky movie as creaky doors and cobwebs.
True.
You just stick them in, and all of a sudden the movie becomes more spooky.
It's an understated, sinister quality.
Yeah, sometimes they're very. You see an owl at night; they have a very profound presence, and I think anyone would recognize that from the cave art of owls to someone seeing an owl tonight. So,
All right. Well, we'll schedule something hopefully in the next month or so for part 3. Next week I got Laird Scranton, then Douglas Dietrich, and still putting together the following month after that.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you guys very much. This has been fascinating as always.